It just makes me nervous, you know. I know Zoom's going to kick me off right when I'm in the feeling the drag, feeling the cook. We don't want to get cooked. We don't want to get cooked in the middle of a lecture, right? We got to keep the momentum going, and we don't want Zoom to cancel us out. We don't want Zoom to stop the beautiful information that's flowing, right? Once it's flowing, as a teacher, guys, as a teacher, you know, when there's a flow, you don't want it to be interrupted. It just can't happen. You know, it's good to keep the momentum going. And there's a compare and contrast of how you can write a scene very much as my teaching methods. So, part one of all of this, right, the subconscious language of cinema. The brain hates uncertainty, right? The brain hates uncertainty. Where's my little, here we go. Okay? Our brain hates uncertainty. It just does. And, here we go. Now, one of the things that goes with that is tension. Tension is incomplete information. Okay? Tension, tension, attention. Okay, good. Tension is incomplete information. Okay? The human brain constantly searches for patterns, for meaning, for prediction, for closure. Cinema manipulates the biological instinct, right? And that is why unanswered questions create suspense. That is why visual ambiguity creates uneasiness, tension. Okay? And how silence creates anticipation. Right? The audience begins mentally participating when we are using these elements to our advantage. For example, let's take a scene out of a make-believe movie here, all right? So now there's a door. Imagine there's a door slightly open in a dark highway. Yeah, there you go. Imagine there's this highway, right? And you're driving through, and then pretty soon it turns into a house, okay? And now you're going down this dark hallway. Because I make really liminal stuff, so let's just go there. But now you're in this hallway after being on the highway. That was already a change. Okay, but you're in this dark hallway, and down at the end of this dark hallway you see a door slightly open. Okay, nothing happens quite yet. But the audience feels tension, right? The audience is feeling tension right off the bat. And why this is happening is because the brain is beginning to generate all of these possibilities. And the fear often comes from not knowing, right? What's behind that door? Is it a monster? Is it whatever, right? Or what's going to happen in front of the door? Who knows? The brain comes up with all these possibilities, starts racing, which creates the fear, really, because you just don't know. It's the unknown. People fear the unknown. Oh, don't get me started on it. So, but actually, yeah, get me started on it. The unknown. No. Unknown. Okay? Prediction. Okay? Unknown. Prediction. Anticipation. Oh. Emotional Okay? You've got your unknown, which then has the brain racing, right? Brain's racing, and it creates the prediction. The prediction, we're predicting what's going to happen, which is now creating this anticipation. It's making you what's going to happen next, which then creates the emotional response. This is a great way of using subconscious language to our advantage when wanting to convey a scene or convey really a reaction out of the audience, bring out a reaction of the audience. This is how you do it. The unknown is creating that process in your brain to want to predict, which then leads to anticipation, leads to an emotional response. Okay? Suspense, right? Suspense is not action. Suspense is expectation. Suspense is expectation. Okay? Now let's look at repetition now as subconscious condition is our next little thing here. Okay? Oh. Okay, I think we're okay here. All right. So repetition as a subconscious conditioning also is vitally important. Okay, let's look at it as this. Repetition. Okay? Repetition creates emotional. Repetition creates emotional programming. Okay? Oh. Repetition creates emotional programming. Okay? When filmmakers repeat sounds, colors, objects, musical themes, even visual framing, as far as cinematography goes, the audience is now subconsciously assigned meaning to them. And eventually the object itself triggers emotion. Okay? For example, let's look at that. Let's look at a flickering hallway light. I'm using a lot of hallways today as my examples, forgive me. But look at a dark hallway and a flickering light in the hallway, right? Or for another example, a distant train horn, way off in the distance, but just loud enough to catch your back of your ear. How about a red, or simple things too, like a red jacket, right? Or a melody, like a not veracity, right? The mama has a melody that she sings to her little Brendan in the beginning of the film. Another example would be like a cigarette lighter, for example, or rain outside of a window. Right? At first, none of these things necessarily mean anything, right? But after repetition, they become emotional triggers. Because it's symbolism is what it is. Symbolism is like teaching the audience a secret emotional language without them realizing that they're learning it. A repeated image in cinema behaves like a bruise, right? Like a bruise. Every time you touch it, the pain deepens. The pain deepens. Symbolism. Through repetition creates the emotional response needed for people to pay attention. Okay? Now, piece here. Camera language. Oh my gosh, I got stuck between camera and carnage or something. I don't. Goodness gracious. I had an old student named Cameron. I guess he's on my mind. There you go. You got me. Ah. Okay, but camera language as a psychology, right? This is our next little thing. By the way, since I fumbled my words, I might as well check my Zoomers, my ZZs. Hopefully our Zoomers aren't catching Z's over here. Oh. Okay, we good. We ball, right? We ball. I need a little more coffee, my goodness. Whew. I try to stay as professional as I can, folks, but I fumble my words, and it is early in the morning and everything. Okay. Camera language as psychology. Okay, let's look at it this way. The camera, right? The camera is not. Whew. Lovely, lovely, lovely. Oh, spelled that wrong. The camera is not neutral, is what I mean by this. Camera language is psychology. We'll look at number one. The camera is not neutral. The camera is never neutral. It shouldn't be, at least. The camera should never be neutral as far as writing these kinds of scenes, or when you're specifically using the subconscious language that you need to in a scene that you want an emotional response to be provoked, right? Camera placement psychologically changes, okay? Camera placement psychologically changes. It changes the power dynamic in a scene. It should change the vulnerability from characters maybe in the scene. It should change the intimacy. It should change the alienation. It should change the, the dominance, if you will, right? For example, a low angle, right? Yeah, here, we'll just draw our little camera here. Okay? All right, so a low angle. For example, a low angle in a scene can create a shift in dominance. It can create a shift in mythology. It can create intimidation, right? Whereas a high angle could create a sense of weakness. A high angle, when the camera's suspended in the air, maybe even, can create a sense of isolation, a sense of exposure, a sense of vulnerability, right? And now let's go right monkey in the middle here. Let's look at close-ups. Close-ups. So let's look at close-up angles. Close-ups of a character or a setting or a scene or whatever, in a scene rather, feels invasive, right? Close-up shots feel almost uncomfortable, right in your view. Can't get away. It's right here, Another example of the psychology behind angles. Let's look at the distant wide shot, right? So that would be this whole thing, right? And this is our wide shot, right? So that whole thing now is our wide shot. What does a wide shot do? It makes characters spiritually feel small. It can convey that feeling of characters being emotionally lost, right? Or it can make characters seem insignificant because now you got this big open space, and they're obviously a little smaller, whether they be in the middle or on the left or the right, doesn't matter. There's still all this open space, and so it creates this insignificant kind of symbolism, if you will. And so let's take an example. For example, let me think of an example. Why does a person crying, for example, let's say we have a person in the middle of this wide shot. So here's our wide shot. Okay? And let's just say we got a person who's right here, and they're crying. Right? They're crying. Why does a person crying in a wide shot feel different than crying in a close-up? Right? And we can do two visualizations here. Two visualizations. Okay? There's our close-up, and there's our wide shot. Why do these feel different? Well, it's everything I was just explaining. One shows emotion, right? The close-up is showing emotion pretty well. Directly. Just straight up emotion, the person's crying. But this other wide shot of the person crying from far away, if you will, that is showing loneliness, right? That's showing the loneliness, which really furthers the emotion, and it really draws out the feeling more for your audience to understand. So always consider angles, close-ups, wide shots, distant shots, oblique shots. Consider all shots as the camera is not neutral. Okay? The camera is not neutral. Okay. Let's go ahead and go to our next thing now. I think we covered the angles pretty well. Oh. Okay. Okay. So our next part here. Here, before we jump in, let me double check it. You know what I gotta double check? Checka. Gotta check our zooms. Hey Zoomers, how we doing? Okay. Okay, we got about 10 minutes. We got about 10 minutes with our Zoomers before we get kicked off Zoom. Oh my goodness, and don't get me started on Canvas. We had a Canvas collapse last week. The whole system went pew, all over the country. Canvas went don't even get me started on that disaster. That's part of the reason why I had last week off for everyone. Not only because of finals, but because Canvas went bye-bye, and so I had to reset the whole thing. I had to double-check that all my material was still, I had to make sure that all my lesson plans were still there. I had to make sure that all the resources were still there for my students. It was a nightmare. Just straight nightmare fuel, if you will. It was just horrible, let me tell you. Really, it would make probably a good script, now that I think of it. Okay, let's go into our next part, though, before I diverge into other things. We're going to jump into the dream logic of a film, right? And why dream logic works so well in film. Okay? Dreams ignore. Oh yeah. Dreams ignore logic. Okay? Dreams ignore logic. But they preserve emotion. Y'all get that? Y'all get that? ignore logic, but they preserve emotion. This is why dreams are so effective. Dreams rarely follow a coherent geography, right? Films that are, very dreamy-like, or that copy dreams, are very effective because dreams rarely follow any kind of coherent geography. You're not juggling logic and all this. No. You're juggling a stable time. There's no stable time. There's no logical transitions, if you will. But yet, emotionally, in these scenes, they often feel much more truthful, and we can mimic these dreams as it's been done before in filmmaking. Because in cinema, we can create, fragmentation, right? In cinema, we can create a non-linear structure, and we can jam-pack our scenes with symbolic repetition and unexplained transitions. And this bypasses the rational analysis and really hits the subconscious directly, right? Films ignore logic, but they preserve emotion. Okay? Just like dreams. That's how we want to approach writing a good script. For example, let's bring up some examples here. Let's look at any David Lynch movie. My Lynchian fans, hello, right? Mulholland Drive, right? Great example of a very, very dreamy-esque movie. Okay, Eraserhead, Blue Velvet. Look at Twin Peaks, the TV show, as example. Very, very dreamlike. David Lynch is very much, the master of this, of incorporating dreams to ignore logic but to preserve emotion. He was on the next level. That's why I even bring him up, folks. Researcher David Lynch. These films often feel emotionally understandable, even when they're quite literally confusing, to the naked eye or on the surface, if you're just looking at it on the surface. I remember the first time I watched Eraserhead, I had no idea what was going on. It was so above my head. It was so past, beyond what I could ever, It wasn't until I started having more of a spiritual journey could I go back and watch it and go, oh, that's what it was about, It's a spiritually understood film. You won't know what's going on in Eraserhead unless you watch it that way. And that's why it's one of the most amazing movies of all time. Go ahead and type in reviews of Eraserhead. I'm sure you'll be surprised how much it's loved. So listen to what I'm saying. Listen to what I'm saying. Dream logic is, it's an emotional gravity. If I could put it into because it's a hard thing to put into lame text terms for you folks, but dream logic in cinema is an emotional gravity replacing physical gravity. A symbolic scene is not asking to be solved. It is asking to be felt. For the subconscious understands poetry faster than logic. Okay? Let's look at our next part here. Dreams. Do you dream? Dreaming. Do you? Dream. Do you dream? Dreaming. Do you? Dream. Okay? Speaking of dreamers, speaking of my dreamers, you know where I'm coming, you know. Come here, Zoom Zooms. Come here, Zoomers. We love you. Let's make sure you're still online. Okay.